I usually start these videos off with like a joke and a couple of emotes, stuff like that, but are you watching right now? Like, look at this. This is ridiculous. This isn't the legend version of the Override Avalon mission, and I get my super in about 25 seconds. The health regen is through the roof, damage resistance is actually ridiculous, and like, I'm basically unkillable. No guns have been shot in the making of this clip, and as you can see, most of the gameplay is in third person already. And by the time I finished my fourth sentence, boom, we have another super. Like, this is just dumb.
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay? No more!
Eyes up, Guardian, it's time for another build video. This time it's on the Arc Titan. So, do you like ability spam? Do you enjoy being unkillable? Do you want to never shoot a gun again in your life? And do you like to smash?
Let me smash.
If the answer is yes to any of these questions, then this is the build video for you. But before we get into that, make sure you hit the like for the YouTube algorithm and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more Destiny build videos. Now let's go! For the super, we're using Thunder Crash, also known as T-Crash, also known as
It's working, Patrick! I'm flying! I'm falling!
It's a great super because of its high burst damage and because it's a one and done super, so you don't have to roam around and risk getting killed. For the class ability, we're going to use Thrusters because it has a very low cooldown and it gives us some extra movement options. For the melee, we're using Thunderclap. Hold down your charged melee button in order to plant your feet and begin charging your fist with Dark Energy, then release to unleash a devastating blast in front of you, dealing damage that increases with longer charge time. This melee deals in the tens of thousands of damage even in legend content and above, and is going to be our primary damage source. For the grenade, we're choosing Pulse Grenade, a grenade that periodically damages targets within its explosion radius. It's going to be a great source of sustained damage, jolt, and ionic traces, which will decrease our cooldowns. Let's move on to our aspects and fragments. Our first aspect is Touch of Thunder, which improves our grenade. The Pulse Nade will now create ionic traces periodically as it damages targets, and it will increase its damage over time. Our second aspect is Knockout. Critically wounding a target or breaking their shield infuses your melee attacks with Dark Energy and increases melee range and damage for a short time. Defeating targets with melee attacks starts health regeneration and makes you amplified. This does interact with our charged melee, so after we get one kill with Thunderclap, we'll get a lot more damage for our next one. For fragments, we have Spark of Shock. Your arc grenades will jolt targets. For all intents and purposes, jolt increases your damage on higher health targets, so it's very beneficial to use. Next, we have Spark of Magnitude. Your pulse grenade will have an extended duration. As far as I've seen, this should be a 50% extended duration, so it's a very good buff. Then we have Spark of Ions. Defeating a jolted target will create an ionic trace. Ionic traces will track to us and decrease our cooldowns, so again a very nice buff. Lastly, we have Spark of Resistance. While surrounded by combatants, you are more resistant to incoming damage. This does stack with tier 10 resilience, so you have a lot more survivability. Let's move on to the weapons, baby. For your kinetic, just use a special which hits like a truck. In the energy slot, put on a primary which has Volt Shot. Volt Shot does interact with Spark of Ions, so it will spawn ionic traces for us. In your heavy slot, put on anything which has a lot of burst damage. In my case, it's a Hothead with explosive light. And now it's time for the exotic. For this build, we're going to use an insurmountable Skull Fort.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time.
Kills with Dark melee abilities trigger health regeneration and restore melee energy. The health regen is very helpful, it will help us out in sticky situations, and the melee regeneration is simply ridiculous. Once you get your chain going, you should get your melee back pretty much all of the time if you manage to get a kill. It's a very simple exotic, but some builds just don't need to be that complex. And it does have a hidden perk where it makes you look like a Daft Punk member. Let's move on to the armor mods. The helmet is pretty much the only place which does not allow us a whole lot of wiggle room, but other than that, you can pretty much pick whatever you want. On the helmet, we're going to use hands-on 3 times. This gives us super energy on melee kills. This setup is what allows us to get our super back incredibly quickly. Hands-on does give diminishing returns, so you can sub one of these mods out for like a heavy ammo finder or something of the sort. But personally, I prefer to go with 3 of them. Since you know most of what you'll be doing will be punching, then it kind of makes sense to just go all out on it. On the hands, we're going to use Focusing Strike, which grants us class ability energy on melee kills. Then personally, I go with a Grenade Kickstart, which will grant us back some grenade energy after we use our grenade. This one is not a necessity, but it does tie in nicely with the rest of the build. Lastly, we're using heavy-handed, which will generate orbs of power on charged melee kills. Since we'll have our charged melee up pretty much all of the times, that means that we'll have a lot of orbs of power. On the chest we're going to use charged up, which will increase the maximum stacks of armor charge we can carry with 1. From here on you can just pick damage resistance mods, however I personally went with emergency reinforcement. It does require you to go into critical health, which is not good, but it does give you a 10% DR bonus, which is pretty nice. But you have a lot of freedom here, so go nuts. On the legs we have Innervation, which reduces our grenade cooldown every time we pick up an orb of power. Then we have stacks on stacks, picking up 1 orb of power will grant us 2 stacks of armor charge. And then we have Recuperation, which will replenish some of our health each time we pick up an orb of power. This is very big for our survivability, so I would suggest you don't skip it. On the class item, we're going to use Outreach twice. It reduces our melee cooldown each time we use our class ability. It is definitely not necessary, but I use it kind of like a safety net if I ever miss my melee. And lastly, we have Reaper. After using your class ability, your next weapon Final Blow will spawn an orb of power. We're almost never going to shoot our guns, but when we do, we'll at least get some orbs of power for it. With all of that out of the way, let's move on to the gameplay loop. Alright, so I gotta be honest with you guys, this is probably going to be my main Titan build for a very long time. It's just so fun. It's the definition of simple, ability spammy, good old fun. There isn't a lot to explain with the build just because it's so simple, but basically what you need to do every time is find a group of at least 3 enemies and thunderclap their asses. For most content in the game, you don't even need to hold down the button for most red bar enemies, you can just let those hands fly.
To catch these hands!
If you ever miss your melee, you can just use your grenade to spawn a lot of ionic traces, which will bring a lot of your cooldowns back. And with our mod setup, every time we use our thrusters, we're going to get melee energy back. While you do get a lot of health regeneration, you should still stick and move, you know, be like Muhammad Ali, hard to hit, and just psycho your melee. The more enemies you kill with it, the more super energy you'll get. This is the main thing you may need some getting used to depending on the type of player you are. The quote-unquote issue here is that you'll get your super incredibly fast, so you actually have to spam it as much as you can. Me, I'm usually very conservative with my super usage, but this build gives you so much super energy, you just have to use it as often as possible. That means if your super is up and you see a Vex chicken running towards you, just T-crash it. A scary Cabal Incinerator captain is coming your way, just T-crash it. A big Taken Wizard is shooting at you, just T-crash it. Anything pretty much breathes towards you, just T-crash it. If you don't, you'll be losing out on a lot of damage, and we don't want that. With this particular setup, you won't really need to use your guns unless you see a champion that you need to stun. Personally, I use the Occluded Finality for this reason, but if you don't have access to it, you can use pretty much anything with Chill Clip. And I know I have said for all of the builds that they can solo dungeons, but this one can solo a dungeon pretty easily, I think. I haven't gotten around to test that theory, but if you do, please make sure you sound off in the comments and tell me how it went. The only places where I don't see this build being absolutely broken are in master content and GMs possibly. I'm saying that because in those types of content you are even more killable, so you have to bob and weave even harder. But looking at it, it's definitely possible. And that's about it for the build, family. Thank you for watching this video. If you're still here, make sure you hit the like for the YouTube algorithm. And if you are still here, I think I've earned your subscription by now. So make sure you sub to my channel for weekly content. You get another build recommendation in the end title card. Eyes up, Guardian, and I'll see you in the next one.